we always advocate for that, but have a more integrated EU approach towards these issues. Thank you for your attention. I'm happy to reply to any questions or to focus on some of the points I've quickly covered for you this morning.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Great, many thanks, Etienne. Any questions, points of clarification for Etienne at this point? No, okay, let's move on. We'll have discussions after Nigel has spoken. Nigel Thornton, Director of Agulhas.
Thanks. Why am I here? Because I was very kindly invited, but primarily because Agulhas, which is a small consultancy based in the UK, has been working on issues around climate change and aid effectiveness separately for quite a while, and then over the last 2 years, really, the two have been merging. Colleague Catherine Cameron was on the core team who wrote the Stern Review. Lots of people say they wrote the Stern Review. She did. She was actually working in there. And myself and others have been involved in aid effectiveness for quite a long time. Last year, UNDP in Bangkok, Tom Bello, with the wonderful acronym CDDE, the Centre for Development of Development Effectiveness. Yes, that is a real acronym, which is based out of the UNDP in Bangkok, asked us to set in process and coordinate a series of case studies on how well climate change finance was linked with the aid effectiveness agenda, particularly through the prism of the Paris Declaration. And before everybody reacts to the words Paris Declaration, just calm down. It's not something that to be scared of, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. And there's a reason for saying that. The case studies we looked at were including Bangladesh and Indonesia, slightly before you guys, so it's nice to see some of the development from that, but also Vietnam, Cambodia, and the Philippines. There are other work possible happening also in Nepal and elsewhere. Following on from that, we are also now involved in case studies for the OECD DAC and the African Development Bank in Africa that's underway. That will be South Africa, Kenya, Tanzania, Ghana, Morocco and Cameroon. And we're just coming to the end of that. And there's also probably going to be some other work happening in the Pacific as well. The piece of work that we did in last year in the case studies in Asia led to a conference in October in Bangkok where it wasn't donors or policy wonks who were there. It was the members of the Ministries of Finance, the Ministries of Environment, the focal points, politicians from the countries in the case studies who got together. Many cases for the first time out of their countries to look at the issue of climate change financing. And in fact, two of the delegations were in the room together from the different countries. I'm not going to say which countries they were. And that was the first time they'd met. Ministries of Finance and Ministries of Environment on climate change. Right, so that was October last year. And at that meeting, for instance, and I'll say that, for instance, the Bangladeshis said, actually, we've got this national committee, it's in paper, and after 3 days they said, but we've never met. Now the reason I'm saying that is let's be a little bit real about what is happening out there and what our perception is and what we want to see happening and what's really happening. Because I think there's sometime in the development discourse there's a disconnect between those two things. Now let's take a step back and say, how have we got to where we are now in terms of climate change financing? Well, I was looking on the Guardian website, the archives, 2 days ago, and for articles about climate change from the 1980s. And in 1989, Margaret Thatcher stood up and said, this is a major challenge, we're going to have to do something about it. We've had a whole political pressure in some quarters for climate change. When has the development discourse got hold of climate change? When did we do it? When were the first people appointed in DFID with the title Climate Change Advisor? Anybody know that? We've got some DFID people here, haven't we?
Yes.
Okay, 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, right? So we've known the challenge. but the development discourse has not been talking about climate change as something of the scale that actually has been going on in parallel. Now, all the discussions about climate change financing, all the issues have been happening separate from that. And a lot of the issues that we're talking about in this room now are because of that kind of genesis, actually, that the lessons around climate change, the lessons around how you do effective external financing, whatever it's for, have not been part of the discourse from on the climate change financing discourse. And some of the tensions we've got now about things like additionality and defining additionality are because of that disconnect. Now that sounds obvious, but actually it's a really important kind of historical context about why some of these debates are emerging at the moment and how also we need to think about going forward. One final thing before I get into the substance. Oh, yeah, sorry, the work, I just want to say one other thing. The work that we're doing in Asia and in Africa, the Asian work was financed by the Swedish CEDA and JICA, as well as sponsored by UNDP. The African work is at the moment financed by African Development Bank, Canada, and OECD. I know EDC has been doing some work in the Pacific, and is potentially doing some work in the Pacific, and there is some other work happening. So there are lots of donors who are thinking about this and working together. The focus of that work is to try and think about putting something to Durban in the middle of the year around the climate change discussions, but also to Busan at the end of the year. So there's actually a process underway about climate change financing and aid effectiveness that is instrumental. It's going to try and lead to something. Right, Paris Declaration. Paris Declaration has got a bad name at the moment as the wave, the fashion falls away, that it's become over-bureaucratised. Let's not forget what the Paris Declaration was about. It's just about some very simple sets of principles, saying that if external finance is going to work, it's got to be domestically owned, right? It's got to be something where actually it's got to be supporting systems and planning locally, alignment. Everybody's got to be working together, which is fairly sensible. We've got to know what we want to achieve, which is the kind of measuring for results bit, and we've got to do what we say we're going to do, which is the mutual accountability bit. It's really simple sets of principles. And all of those principles, really, there's no reason why any of them shouldn't apply to external financing for climate. And in fact, as we've heard, climate financing externally is not going to work unless if those principles also apply to it. So let's not pretend that this is something different or that it's all scary. But so what are the kind of things that we've been finding from our case studies? Well, actually, I don't need to say anything because they've virtually all been said today. But I'm just going to pick a few things out. One of the key issue about ownership is all climate finance that is provided in country really owned by the countries? Now, Khurshid said something really important. Okay? And what he said was, in Bangladesh, climate change is not a domestic political issue. In none of the case study countries that we're working in, right, that's 11 countries, is it a domestic political issue, with the exception of Vietnam now, and that's because of the very highly centralised planning system that they've got. 2 or 3 people have got it, and in the November conference, part of the party conference, it was put on their political agenda. But in terms of now, what that was about was the leadership getting it. Okay, in Vietnam. Now, Vietnam, you haven't got a direct accountability through the vote, really. In a lot of the countries that we're working in, it just doesn't appear. BBC World Service Trust have done some very interesting work in Africa. They've done surveys of climate change perceptions. I'm sure people have seen those. They're really interesting. If you go to somewhere like Tanzania, the population in Tanzania says, look, okay, we know that the climate is changing, but that's, in my village, that's because the people next door have cursed us. Or that's because we've not planted enough trees. The idea of global impact of anthropogenic climate change and what has to happen locally is just not on the political agenda. Now, what does that then mean about policy making? Policy making becomes something that is technically led, and it's something that it's not about a demand for a domestic agenda, it's something that technical people have to be there, but they also have to get the ownership of senior politicians. So the senior politicians, how many senior politicians in a lot of the countries that we're looking at really get climate change? Very few. There's one particular country that we're working in, we're doing the case study of where they really do get it, but that's actually because one very senior politician has interest in the ethanol industry, and he's going to stand and is gaining from moving to clean energy, which means that they're not anywhere on the adaptation agenda. Point is, ownership at the national level is very, very, very weak on politics and climate change, and that's why a lot of the policies of national policies are very, very poor at the coordinating level. Etienne's made the point about there's no national capacity. Well, that's why there's no national capacity, because the capacity is being put in response to external agendas on climate change, where if you want to be part of Kyoto, you have to have a focal point. Well, who's that going to be? Well, or RED, you know, it's forestry, or it's down in the Ministry of Environment. And only now, when the funds flow are increasing, are the ministries of finance getting involved, because they're realising it's an awful lot of cash that's going to come in. But those ministries who've been historically involved in this whole process are weak, very weak in their internal structures. And that means the internal politics of those countries is that it's very hard for them to start holding other line ministries to account if they want to mainstream this. It's also very hard for them to make sure that the financing is integrated in overall development planning. So that's the kind of phase we're in at the moment, when the line ministries, it's still very fragmented within countries, where you've got national planning. So the Indonesia example, where Bappenas has been included and has got it. Sometimes, as is the case in Indonesia, the international community is still preferring to work down at the line ministry level, which actually undermines the coherence and the development of a national coherent plan. And that's exactly what's happening in Indonesia, and it's happening elsewhere. But what we know from aid effectiveness is if there isn't an overall coherent plan at the national level, you're not going to get overall management of the response. So again, this is kind of, all of that pattern is something we're seeing globally still. And what that then means is that, linked to that, if you haven't got a strong national planning process, alignment from the donors actually supporting national plans, tends to be still fragmented. It tends to be down in line ministry level, and that also satisfies their incentives at the moment. Think about where a lot of this funding has come from. We had a question about CDM. I'm including that kind of finance in this. The incentives are still very much to get the cash out. Norway has gone, and other countries have gone with big wadges of cash and said, here it is. What's the government going to do? The government is going to say, oh, we haven't got a plan. No, the government's going to say, thanks very much, and we're going to take that plan. But it's not necessarily going to be integrated with the national planning process. What you've got also is one country we've worked in, they applied for one set of financing that was executed externally, and the executing agency said, no, you can't have that money. We want to give you this money. The government, I've got to be very careful because I can't name either of them. The government said, but we don't want that money because that has these conditions on it. And they said, no, you can only have that money. That kind of execution problem, the fact that there isn't any local ownership, there isn't any alignment, is getting worse and worse as the fragmentation of the global funding, it just goes exponential, and that's what's happening now. Now, the only way to solve that is actually back at headquarters, and also potentially, which is what the Asian countries that met in Bangkok wanted, with single funds, like in Bangladesh. But you get a situation like Bangladesh, where you've got one fund that's set up, the government says fund it. The British government, and I know at least one person in this room knows this, that the British government has spent at least £70 million over the last 15 years building financial management and accounting systems in Bangladesh, but it won't put the money into a domestic trust fund. It then sets up a parallel one. Yeah. Now, it ain't going to work. What the countries in Asia wanted, they want trust funds that then can have all of the different vertical external funding going to that single place. It can then be domestically executed, and then it can be integrated with domestic budgeting, either through shadow budgeting or actually straight into budgets. And that's what the Asian governments that we met in Bangkok wanted. And there's actually something called the Bangkok Call for Action, which I kind of ask you all to look at, because that's what the Asian countries wanted as a kind of, as a mechanism. Now, again, there has to be an honouring of that desire if this system is going to work. And I think, anyway, I could go on, as you can tell, but I won't do. That links to the next point, which is, of course, about harmonisation. In none of the countries that we've worked in, right, none of them have all the external providers of finance sat around a table together. Right, not one. Now, isn't that remarkable? All the external who's saying they're providing climate change finance, even though you've got Paris Declaration principles, you've got all of that. Now, the one that's almost done it is Cambodia, but it's not quite. Now, that's bizarre, but you're not going to get harmonisation until the donors themselves start talking to each other. But the problem is you've got the classic things of competition coming in about and etc. And I could go on that. One final thing about alignment, harmonisation, and measuring for results. We've got a massive definitional problem that we still haven't solved about what is climate change financing. How do we demonstrate additionality, as has already been talked about. But before you do that, you have to say what was the baseline, so then you're saying what it's additional to. We haven't defined any of that, and therefore we can't count how much we're spending on climate change. It's as simple as that. Anybody who says they know what's being spent on climate change is lying, okay? Because you have not, there is not the global system and there's not comparators, and all the donors have got different standards on this. So we just don't know what's being spent. We've got some good ideas, and you know, there's fantastic websites that's sponsored by ODI and others that do that. And the final point is this thing about mutual accountability. Yes, there's a whole issue about predictability. There's a whole issue about that we've heard about again, and that again is being played out all the way through. A lot of the countries that we've been working at, not a lot of them, some of them have said we just don't believe the donor community, the external community, is going to provide the money it says it's going to do. So we're not going to engage with them. There's one particular country where they're only doing on the CDM, and they only want to do on that finance because they can see the money. Okay, on money for adaptation. Until that cash is on the table, they're not going to talk, right? Now that's a perfectly understandable position to take, I think. So, yeah, I mean, so I think what the headline is, all that I've heard today really is entirely consistent with the findings that we're coming out, but there is a process underway to try and bring this up into the discourse. The convergence of the communities for the climate financing and the development is happening, but it's not there yet. And this meeting and this series is part of that process. So thank you.
Many thanks, Nigel. Look,